All right. Hello, 741 students. This week we're talking about dimensional data collection. And so you have materials already, an article and the book chapter to read. And then there is a PowerPoint that goes along with the chapter as well. And tonight I'm going to highlight some important points. So I'm going to talk through a different PowerPoint that just has some talking points to keep me on track while I discuss. The article you probably noticed is written from an educator point of view or targeting educators. And so you might see that it looks a little different or talks about behavior and data collection a little bit differently than our book does. So I would say that we're always going to default to the more technical terminology. And so your book chapter has technical definitions and technical descriptions for data collection. I don't think there's anything in the article that necessarily contradictory, but sometimes might be oversimplified or might use some different terms. And I think the article can be useful for simplifying things, so it's why I included it. I also think it's important because for most of us, we're either going to be working with educators at some point in some capacity, collaborating and working together to serve clients, or we might be working in schools or as educators ourselves and doing behavioral work. And so I think it's nice to keep both perspectives. So those are the readings. I'm going to go through some talking points that highlight some concepts from the chapter. And then if you have questions, feel free to email or pop into the chat session on Thursday. So up until this point, we have talked about different ways of collecting data. We've talked about indirect methods for gathering data, and then we started talking about direct methods, and we started with the ABC assessment information. And so last week, you went through the steps for doing an ABC assessment, collecting those data and analyzing those data. The other thing that we need to do when we're directly observing is measure the behavior. And this can be done at the same time as we collect the ABC data, or it can be done as two separate steps. And so my recommendation is usually if you are new to this, or if you're in a situation where maybe the behavior is complicated, or maybe your observations are really short, but you maybe have a longer period of time, then I recommend doing the ABC assessment first and then measuring the behavior. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So by doing the ABC assessment first, the type of data we're collecting for the ABC assessment allow us some time to tweak and tighten our operational definition before we collect measurement data. And so we can use that time to solidify our definition. Once we collect measurement data, we cannot change our behavior definition, or if we're in a situation where we really need to, then we would have to start over with data collection, because we need the data we collect to be consistent for the same definition across all of our observations. So that's one reason. And then the other that we'll talk about in a little bit is that this can help with reactivity that you might experience. So reactivity is when we're out collecting data and the behavior we're trying to collect data on, the person who is exhibiting that behavior might react to our presence or the presence of equipment or materials we have in the space while we're observing. And so we're not seeing what that behavior typically looks like without intervention. We're seeing what it looks like while we are there observing. And typically that wears off over time. And so if we are collecting some ABC data to begin with, again, those data are the way we do that process is more forgiving, right? Because we're writing down lots of different things we're seeing, and really it's the analysis that helps us get to the function. And so that can be helpful. So by the time we get to measuring, then we're seeing a more typical behavior, and we can get a more accurate measure of what that behavior looks like. And then the baseline data are really important. I don't think this is something that future behavior analysts or behavior specialists would be sort of wondering about or concerned about, but sometimes people in other disciplines are. Why are we wasting time collecting baseline data? So some people feel like it might be a waste of time, especially if they already have ideas of what interventions might work. People want to jump right in and do those interventions so we can help our student or client as soon as possible. And so that makes sense from a human perspective, right? We care and we want to help. But the baseline data are very important because the other key piece here is that we want to be able to know if our intervention is working. And the best way we can do that is collect data so we can, at the very least, make a comparison from baseline to intervention. And that's not the strongest design, but when we're out in the field, sometimes that is the only design that we're going to be able to implement. And so we want some baseline data so we can compare intervention data. And then the book chapter talks about 4 characteristics of a good measurement system. And you have your activity this week, you're going to talk about this as well. So I don't want to say too much so that you can have a discussion on the discussion board with your own words. But I did want to highlight, because this is very important. When we think about and make decisions for how we will measure behavior, we want to make sure our measurement system has these 4 characteristics. So first of all, it needs to be sensitive to capturing small changes. And so an example here might be if we think about maybe a tantruming type behavior where a student engages in a response class of behaviors, maybe yelling and hitting and throwing themselves on the floor. And we're deciding between collecting duration data or a frequency count. Well, if we counted a frequency count, maybe they have that tantrum 1 time a day, but when they do, it lasts 45 minutes. If we collected frequency data, that would tell us they do it once a day. And the only change we could possibly see is if that went up or if we got it down to 0. But what would be more sensitive to change would be if we had a duration. So if we measured the 45 minutes, our intervention might work on decreasing that time. And so that would capture and allow us to see small changes in time. So going from 45 minutes to 40 actually could be pretty meaningful because that's 5 fewer minutes of having to keep the students safe and keep other students on task while that's happening. 5 fewer minutes that we have to be having multiple staff coming in to help. So every 5 minutes that we shave off could be very meaningful. So we want to make sure our system captures that small change, that it's meaningful. We want to make sure that our measure is objective, and so we want it to be clear. We want to make sure that we can observe what it says we're measuring. The third thing is that we want it to be reliable, so it needs to be consistent. And this is where having a really strong definition is key, so that anybody who comes in could look at that definition and could observe, and that we would get the same count. In a perfect world, we would get the same exact count or the same exact measure of that behavior. But more realistically, we would have a very similar number at the very least. And so the book chapter talks about inter-observer agreement. And this is when 2 people independently observe and then compare the data. And then we look at the percentage that those 2 people have in common with their data. And we can do a calculation. And so we want to have high inter-observer agreement, or IOA, because then that tells us that our measure is reliable. And so in research, we would try to have a percent of the observations done by 2 people so that we could collect IOA. And then we would be looking for good IOA scores. Different people put different numbers on this, and the book makes some good points. So sometimes people say, well, we want it above 80%, but if that range was 60 to 100, that's still not necessarily very good IOA. If we have a tighter range, but we had 78%, that might be more meaningful than the 80% or more show better reliability. So if you're doing research, you would look to other research similar to what you're doing and see what others have done and choose a number. In practice, you sometimes just have what you have, unfortunately. And so you do your best to get some inter-observer agreement. The other concept that the book talks about when we talk about reliability is observer drift. And this is when over time, as we're observing, we start to veer from that original behavior definition. And it's typically unconscious. It's not something we do on purpose. It's unintentional. We are observing, and we observe it so much that we might start to count another similar behavior, or we might stop counting a certain instance of the behavior, and then our numbers will become skewed. So we have to watch for this, and having 2 observers can help, because if somebody is drifting, we might catch it more quickly when we notice that that IOA is low. And then finally, we want to make sure we have a valid measure. And so that means that we're measuring what we claim to be measuring. And this gets to reactivity, which I talked about earlier as well, that it's possible to see some changes in the student or client's behavior just based on our presence or the presence of our materials. So we might distract them, and then their behavior might look different than it typically does. And so this usually goes away over time. So doing enough observations is the best tool we have for this. The other thing that we can do to try to combat this would be trying to be as inobstructive as possible. So if we have a way to blend in, come in with as few materials as possible. There have been times where I've observed and I sort of become part of the classroom. So then I might actually help some other students as well while I'm there observing, with my primary goal being to observe, but I'm doing some other things. So it's not as if I'm just sitting in the back of the room, with a video camera and a clipboard, being very obvious about what I'm doing. So those are some things to think about for combating reactivity. The chapter also talks about treatment integrity, and this is really important. And if you read much research, you will notice that there is a shortage of data collection on treatment integrity, or also called fidelity of implementation. And this is when we're measuring how well an intervention is carried out. And unfortunately, we don't spend a lot of time on this as a field. We don't spend as much time as we should. And even in research, when interventions are being tested, not everybody is collecting these data to support the fact that the intervention was carried out as it claimed to be carried out, which is really important, because otherwise the data we don't really know what the data are telling us if we don't know what the intervention looked like. So we need to know what that intervention looked like in terms of a research study, and in practice as well. When we're out in the field, we need to keep track of what steps people are completing and which ones they're not, if there are some that are being missed or implemented in not the best way, so that we can continue to revisit that and retrain and coach as needed, so that we are actually implementing evidence-based interventions and not some version of that that can sometimes occur due to lack of training or treatment drift. So the book talks about treatment drift as well. And this is when intervention gets off course. And this is something that also can happen unintentionally. We get sort of fatigued, or maybe certain steps are kind of cumbersome, so eventually we omit them because it seems like the other ones are going well. We have a sense that the intervention is working pretty well, so we don't feel like we have to do all the steps. Or we start to feel like the intervention is not working, so why do all the steps? So those can be conscious decisions, but sometimes are unconscious, where we're just sort of going about doing many things often, and then the treatment changes and we're not following all the steps. So what can be helpful a lot of times is having a fidelity checklist. So a list of all the steps that need to be done, and as interventionists, we can be checking those ourselves. And if you're lucky enough to have multiple people, you can take turns observing each other and also collect those data. And then this part, which I think is sort of the meat of the chapter, or the piece that you, so all the other parts sort of set us up for thinking about how we're going to measure the behavior, planning for measuring, and then deciding specifically how we will measure behavior. And the book gives us some different ways to think about measuring behavior. And some you probably already used, and maybe others you haven't thought about. So event recording is a frequency count, and so that is one that's pretty easy, simply counting how often the behavior happens. This should be converted to a rate so that we can compare across observation sessions, regardless of if those observation sessions are the same length of time. We can do duration recording, and that would be measuring how long a behavior lasts. And this also can be converted. This could be converted to percent of time, or percent of that observation time. Latency is the amount of time between a stimulus and the start of a behavior. So this one is more common with directions. So maybe a direction is given, and then the amount of time it takes for the individual to begin that behavior, that would be the latency. The inner response time is how much time in between the end of one behavior and the start of a new one. So maybe the student engages in that behavior that we want to see, but there are very big lags in between each response. And so that might be something we're interested in shorting shortening so that the student will have more of those responses in a period of time that we're working with the student. And then the book also talks about interval time sampling systems. And these can be very useful because they allow us to measure the behavior during intervals as opposed to having to watch for long periods of time. But they can be a little bit complicated in setting up. And so as you read through the chapter, you can see what those look like and let me know if you have more questions. They're, in terms of the concepts, they're not as complicated as they look. Setting them up takes a little bit of thinking and planning. But the different ways to measure the intervals are whole, partial, and momentary time sampling. And so whole interval means that you would have, so with intervals, you'd have intervals set up, and whole interval means that during that whole interval, the behavior was occurring. And if it was, then we count it. So you might think of it as ones and zeros. So it counted, it happened the whole next interval, it counted, it happened for part of the next interval, then we don't count it. And partial interval is just the opposite. If it happened at any point in that interval, we would count it. So it happened for a little while, we count it. It happened for a little while, we count it. It didn't happen in the next one, we don't count it. And then finally, momentary time sampling is when we would look at the end of a time interval and see if it's happening in that moment. And so if it's not, even if it happened all the way up until our timer went off, we wouldn't count it. But if it is happening when our timer goes off, we count it, even if that was the first instance of seeing that behavior. And so those are some methods that can be considered maybe shortcuts so that we can better maybe multitask, for example. But again, they take some legwork getting set up in the beginning because you need to have your interval set and you need to be clear about what you're measuring. And then the book talks about some potential downfalls, right? There's going to be discrepancy between what you gather in each of those different systems based on how you're making decisions. I did read an article a couple years back that looked at how well these systems can actually work. And if you do a good job of matching it to what you're studying or what you're observing, they can actually be fairly accurate. Even if they're off a little bit, if you stay the same from baseline to intervention, it can show us a sort of proportion of change. So that can be useful as well. So the book talks about that, and the book talks about IOA with some detail on how to calculate that as well. So you can read about that also. And so that is all I have. I lost my screen share. All I have